we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Anyway, if you're coming back in now, I had to cut some stuff because we played copyright material, but it was it Paul McCartney saying meow again on YouTube, and now Paula can't stop laughing.
This is coming because
Paula's literally crying in front of me.
This is all happening because there's like this video circling in social media right now of Paul McCartney trying to promote something, and then he just ends the video with meow. And it really got to me. I don't know why. He is my favorite Beatle, which is a controversial Beatle to choose, and I will take that argument up in the streets.
I have no transition into the podcast, but we are, if we sound different, maybe
because we do.
Yeah, it's because we do. So I think we spoke about in season 1, the University of Warwick now has podcasting studios. And there was one that we were told about and we were having a hard time accessing because I think only a few students can access, like in a certain discipline, because they need it. But now they've got more podcasting spaces and we have one here. And so we booked it and we came in and we were faced with so much wires, so much equipment, but we twisted a few knobs and it's working.
I like how you say we.
Well, Paula did. I looked impressed.
Yeah, Hannah was crying over instructions that weren't even for this part of the studio, and I just turned the soundboard on.
Yeah, so you have Paula to thank for this crispy, clear audio.
Hopefully it's crispy and clear.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. And hopefully me dying of laughter off mic did not put you all off from today's subject, which is poststructuralism.
So kind of like the introduction to queer theory, you know, I took that introduction to queer theory and scripted that. So Paula's kind of scripted this episode, and then I'm doing the next intro to in this season.
So a bit of a disclaimer. This is my interpretation of poststructuralism. There is little to no consensus of how to talk about this, how to present this forward. So I'm doing what I do best, which is basing it in its historical context and trying to explain this as crystal clear as possible. And in making it as crystal clear as possible, I'm going to be using a bit of language and words that may not be fully associated with poststructuralism and poststructuralist discussion, but I'm using them because it is a good jumping off board into this realm and field of study. So if you don't like the certain words I use or you don't like a certain description, that's completely fine. This is just basically to provide a very basic understanding of what poststructuralism looks like now in academia.
I'm looking forward to it. So Paula sent me a bit of reading, but you know, this is more your wheelhouse than mine.
Well, I can ask you, how did you find the reading?
No, I really enjoyed the reading actually, and we're going to put it in the description like we always do. It's still, again, it's this kind of theory. An introduction to theory is always a tiny bit abstract, but you know, I knew a lot of the thinkers that is being drawn upon.
So for this episode, we are using the introduction chapter to James Williams' book, Understanding Poststructuralism. So it's not easily accessible, unfortunately. This introductory chapter, I was able to get access from it through the university. However, if you hit up your local public library, I highly recommend the book. Basically, he goes through very simplified schools of thought. So he goes through Foucault, Derrida, all throughout this text. And that's why I really wanted to include this introduction chapter. And it's not the easiest read. It is pure philosophy. But I think it does a really good job of showing and illustrating that poststructuralism isn't just a philosophy. It is something that we have discussed behind the scenes as a praxis. So if you don't know what praxis is, I'm using this word very, very purposefully. So the technical definition for praxis is a practice as distinguished from theory, accepted practice, or custom. Why I'm using this very specific word is because it's an all-encompassing thing where it's not just practicing a subject or practicing a field, it's actually living with the philosophy. And post-structuralism cannot be seen as just something you pick up and go forth. It is something that you live and something that you continue to do in your everyday life. And that is why I gave the warning in the beginning of this episode. This is a very slippery, sticky subject, and I don't know if I'm going to do it justice, but hopefully I do.
I'm sure it will be good. And, you know, like we said, this is our understanding of post-structuralism. You can get simpler understandings, and we'll include some sources. You can also get more complicated, fragmented understandings of post-structuralism, but hopefully this will give you a way into understanding it.
Yeah, and for this episode, I'm also including in our sources and in our reading list accessible stuff. However, it's going to be in different languages. So I know I have an interview with Michel Foucault in the 60s/70s, I think it was 69 or 70. That one's fully in French, but I'm going to include debates with Noam Chomsky. I'm also going to include some YouTube videos alongside of this. So hopefully, even if you don't fully understand the argument, maybe even listening to these arguments can sort of solidify where this is coming from. And I think with that said, let's get started.
So if you're kind of breaking it down to its simplest parts, what is post-structuralism?
So don't clock me, but I'm going to use a Wikipedia definition. I'm using it because it's the most straightforward thing I have found. So it's, quote, post-structuralism is a philosophical movement that questions the objectivity or stability of various interpretive structures that are posited by structuralism and consider them to be constituted by broader systems of power. This is quite ambiguous because it's like, what is structuralism? What are structures? What do you mean broader systems of power? Within the text we read for this episode, it posits post-structuralism as being made up of different components that are sort of functioning together in different parts, different times, different ways, and different mannerisms. So Williams describes post-structuralism as a set of experiments on texts, ideas, and concepts that show how the limits of knowledge can be crossed and turn into disruptive relations. It is really hard to describe exactly what post-structuralism is, since it tends to be like a very slippery subject. It is purposefully described as a praxis because its methodological state encompasses everything from the sciences to the arts to politics. Post-structuralism is a praxis of extending beyond the limitations of knowledge and challenging pre-existing notions of power. It is taking ideas and pre-established thought processes apart, rearranging, and then transforming them. It is a practice of disruption that confronts the status quo without antithetical approach. And the phrase status quo is not really used that much within post-structuralism, but I'm using it here because I think it's the quickest way to sort of see the ties between concepts of knowledge and cultural ideas of a naturalized knowledge.
Yeah, and I did want to add on to that because in the Wikipedia definition, you know, it talks about objectivity and challenging and questioning this objectivity. And if you Google objectivity, you'll come up with one idea, but it's this idea that in academia, we can use impartial language, we cannot be emotive. Objectivity is seen as a kind of correct form of science. And lots of things have come out of the past few years and even before that that really questioned this idea of a stable, objective truth.
Yeah, and post-structuralism, as we're going to get into even the historical context, it is not about stability. It's about a constant situation of flux. If you want to know a little bit more about how that is in practice, I highly, highly recommend you listen to our episodes on Deleuze and on Foucault, where you can sort of see where these systems of disruption, how they function. But for this episode, Like, we're going to be saying a bunch of big words, and unfortunately, we're going to be moving straight past them because we do not have enough time. But with that said, I would like to provide a little bit of a historical context. So where does post-structuralism come from? There's a lot of arguments about its different iterations and how it showed up in the West, and now like conversations we have with like the author J. Daniel Luther. These post-structuralist writers kind of have spread out and taken new forms and new lives. But where we're going to be focusing on is the original Sorbonne group, which means the simple answer to where this all came from is 1960s France. So the emergence of post-structuralism came about in France as it was recuperating from the Second World War and basically becoming, again, a global power through both massive changes politically and within the intellectual space. Under the Fifth Republic, so under President Charles de Gaulle, so like around 58 to the late 60s, France experienced a significant sociopolitical change that forever altered France's global power. Under de Gaulle, France committed a series of war crimes against the Algerian people during the Algerian War that took place between 56 to 62. Additionally, France involved itself in the Nigerian Civil War and worked to attain nuclear power in the post-war period. There's also, later on, alongside the United States, you get the dissolution of French Indochina, you get the Vietnam War. Within France, de Gaulle's leadership approach had become a source of rising protest, and predominantly from the academic and intellectual circles due to his heavy-handed approach. De Gaulle controlled many media outlets and systems of reporting, which of course altered the realities of France's presence abroad and its own suppression of citizens. Under de Gaulle, France spied and surveyed members of the opposition, including student and worker unions and his own political rivals. Protests reached a pinnacle in May 1968 as protesters created barricades and initiated street battles with the police. These protests were violent and may have led to a civil war happening within France. So May 1968 is extremely significant because these protests were integral to the emergence of post-structuralism, as many of the students and protesters striking government declared stances against France's capitalist consumerism, foreign policy, and traditional institution. May 1968 is particularly significant because what started with student protests on the 6th of May led to unification across many other different protests, including worker strikes across France, that eventually led to the dissolution of the government and the end of de Gaulle's presidency. And regardless of the outcome of the elections that year and the legacy of these protests, which have been contested, and in the show notes, I've included Smithsonian Magazine coverage of these protests in the 60s, it did cement an intellectual questioning of government and structures of power within France's intelligentsia. Theorists that we've covered before, like Deleuze, Guattari, and Foucault, have reflected on this time with varying opinions, but nonetheless cite this as a significant proponent to their work. I am of the belief that without these protests, post-structuralist thought could not have risen, and it could not have occurred anywhere else but in France.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I was going to say, I think in the Foucault episode that we did with James, we do actually mention these protests very briefly when we're going into the history of Foucault, you know? So yeah, it's important.
Yeah, because these protests were not just happening within Paris. They were happening in the Sorbonne. They were happening everywhere. So there was a genuine fear that this would lead to civil unrest and civil war because, you know, technically France never finished its revolution. So there was a huge fear. So I basically set up the historical context of why these things are happening. But once more, post-structuralism is not linear. So it does have a lot of other influences. So Williams cites that the roots for post-structuralism are about, here's the 5 basic ones: Heidegger and hermeneutics, phenomenology and Husserl, psychoanalysis and Freud, transcendentalism and Kant, and existentialism and Nietzsche. We're brushing very quickly through these. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because when you start looking into other post-structuralist authors and literary workers, these themes consistently come about, specifically with people like Lacan and Kristeva. Their work is sort of tied to these roots, but then goes completely in a different direction. And they sometimes go together, they sometimes don't. So I really wanted to include that sort of the narrative that I think is going on around this season, which is building upon other schools of thought. Specifically, by the 60s, academic philosophy is very much integrated into building blocks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I was speaking to you about this the other day because, an example that I always see happen is quite often people place Foucault and Freud in opposition with each other in how they're thinking. And that is one way to think about it. But it also doesn't unpack the way in which, these other thinkers like Freud and Heidegger and Kant and Nietzsche and Husserl, they form the building blocks of theories that often undermine them. You know what I mean? So I think it's very interesting.
You did the perfect transition into the next part of this is like, why is it called poststructuralism? What is structuralism, period? So I'm going to use another Wikipedia definition. So structuralism is an intellectual, current, and methodological approach primarily in the social sciences that interprets elements of human culture by the way of their relationship to a broader system. It works to uncover structural patterns that underlie all things that humans do, think, perceive, and feel. It functions within parameters of an established norm and foundational knowledge as established by the pattern found within natural and unnatural systems within humanity. It cements life within the boundaries of in a finite system in function. So it basically is binaries. So putting Foucault and Freud as oppositions would be kind of a structuralist thing to do. We're not going to go into detail, and I'm not going to expand on that because it's not the point of this episode. But you have to kind of take, for example, like what I mean by natural systems of structure. So the human day-to-day cycle has been universalized. You wake up, you eat food throughout the day, you grow tired throughout the day. Once the sun sets, you go to sleep, and then you do that thing all over again. That very basic understanding that is shown as a natural order of human life then becomes an established norm. If you wake up during the night and sleep throughout the day, that is going outside of that binary. So it is then seen as a peculiarity or something that is not functioning within like these cultural understandings and basically going against status quo.
It's really interesting that you kind of use this example of like waking up in the morning, eating, growing tired, sleeping at night, because queer theorist thought really plays with this idea of having an established pattern of life, right? And a text I can tell you to read if you're interested in this is Elizabeth Freeman's Time Binds Queer Temporalities, Queer Histories, because I forget the name of the exact theory, but they use this idea of we're biologically tied to a certain kind of time frame. And, it's very much within, I guess, post-structuralist understandings to really question that.
No, you're absolutely right. And yes, that's such a good reading. I haven't read it in forever.
Yeah.
We're included in the show notes. So that is basically how structuralism works. And this is, once more, an extremely simplified thing. But you have to remember, like, it is a form of upholding power. Because once you create a binary, that binary is then supported by other actors. So you have to uphold the binary. And by upholding the binary, you're upholding a certain power. And whoever dictates how that binary is supposed to function, that is the source of power. Where I'm going with this basic structuralist argument is that there is a foundation between structuralism and post-structuralism that works for both and then disrupts. So this leads us to everyone's favorite sign, signifier. Take it away, Hannah.
So we've talked about this in the Deleuze-Guattari episode. We also spoke about this in the Stuart Hall episode that I did with Dipuk. So I'm going to give essentially the same overview that I gave there, but it will help you understand kind of moving forward. And I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. So where I'm getting this information from is a video on YouTube from Tom Nicholas called Semiotics WTF, Introduction to Saussure, the signifier and the signified. So semiotics is a study of signs, and a sign is something that stands in for something else. So words can be considered signs. We've been laughing about it because there's an example in the Williams text that is about a horse. So if you write down the word horse, it can evoke the idea of a horse. But physical actions can also be signs as well. You know, if I wave to you, often that means hi, hello, it's a greeting, right? It can also happen in abstract ways as well. For example, the word anger. And you can have signs in nature. So smoke equals fire, usually puddles equal rain, right? It's happening outside as we speak. So Ferdinand de Saussure in 1916 in a book called The Course in General Linguistics talks more about this. So the sign has two elements. It has the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the thing that does the standing in for something else, and the signified is the thing or idea that the person trying to communicate is trying to evoke. There's no inherent link, according to Saussure, between the signifier and the signified. So he was really interested in how the use of the letters D-O-G means dog, and how it doesn't really have, you know, those letters don't really have any natural link to the animal other than what we as a society have decided that's what it means. So also when we refer to dog, we're not referring necessarily to a specific dog. You know, we've given the example in the past that if I say the word dog, you're probably thinking of different dogs as audience members. You know, I often think of a German Shepherd because that's what I've had in my family.
Yeah, and I think of a weenie dog because that's what we have in my family.
Right? And so we're more referring to this concept of dogginess. And when we're describing a particular dog, we're referring to a concept of dogginess to evoke the image of a particular dog. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic summary. So how Saussure works within structuralism is that, yeah, he sets out these ideas. That is a structure. That is a form of A plus B equals C or A to Z. Like, it has a structure to how you get there. But there's also the element of arbitrariness. So to directly quote Saussure, he writes, arbitrary in relation to its signification within which it has no natural connection in reality, end quote. So in other words, Saussure proposes that there is a connection between object and language, but that connection is not naturally occurring, like you said. It posits that language may perform within a binary, but its actual sound does not. To put it in even simpler terms, boundaries, binaries, and limits can be deconstructed. So dogginess can be broken apart and transformed into something else. So we may create a new word for dogginess. We might call it wow-wowness or bark-bark, and that becomes now the word. A more simple, realistic example is the use of the word goodbye. Goodbye used to mean may God be with you, and it became an acronym, and now we have goodbye. Those two things technically mean the same thing, invoke the same meaning, but they sound completely different. So this is where poststructuralism starts taking its legs. It's saying, but what if things don't mean what they should mean? It's starting to question, why is there dogginess? What makes up dogginess? Why should we consider what dogginess should be made up of? Which leads us to what I define as poststructuralism. Poststructuralism is composed of two things: disruption and power. So with language, it's integral as it demonstrates a disruption of our secure sense of meaning and reference in language of our understanding of our senses in the state of the arts, of understanding of identity, understanding a sense of history and its role in the present, and in our understanding of language as something free of the work of the unconscious. So it's basically destroying the binary. There's no other way to say it. It's taking the binary and taking a baseball bat to it, taking a look, and then trying to put it together in a way that is completely different.
Actually, a good example of that is Butler's use of the word gender, right? Because it's a complete questioning of what that even means, right?
Exactly. And we will talk briefly about Butler near the end of this. So it disrupts by tearing apart the limitations set up in the pursuit of knowledge, questions those limitations by problematizing them, and then transfigures them. So in my notes I wrote transforms, but I think the word transfigure is a much more eloquent way of describing what it's supposed to mean, because it does change states. So if you want to think about Harry Potter, think about Harry Potter with transfiguration, but it's taking an element and then completely altering what it's supposed to be, but there's still like a bit of a thread connecting to it. So once more, we wouldn't put Foucault or Freud against each other. What post-structuralist thought sees it as is the transformation of Freud, moving it beyond the state that it was currently done and making it into something else, which is questioning the systems of binaries that Freud set up and seeing how that can then be applied to something else. And in disrupting these elements and these binaries, you start questioning systems of power. Like we said before, power is what upholds binaries. It sets the limits of knowledge and establishes of binaries are constituted by social structures of power. Power is what reinstates and binds together what is understood to be hegemonic norm. Take, for instance, the tardy system and set up by schools. School as an institution enforces a system in which one is either tardy or not. This is then monitored by teachers, hall monitors, and other points of authority onto individuals. Schools uphold power in regard to someone either being tardy or within an organized understanding of what is tardiness.
I also kind of want to interject here that it's really interesting to use schools as an example of power, because often people don't, or sometimes people don't think about it. Like I've taught about education a lot and trying to get students to reassess that school is actually like a microcosm of society. It's teaching you to interact with power in particular ways.
So I'm basing this off of Foucault and his writings on like discipline. So I'm using the schools very purposefully. But also another reason I'm including schools is that tardiness does not affect your educational understanding if there's other influence outside of this. So usually schools say, well, you cannot be tardy because you'll miss what you learned in class. But what if you are already doing extra courses? What if you just make up for this by attending after school systems or some sort of learning, or you supplement it in other ways? That is questioning why the tardy system exists. So it's a bit of a confusing, it's very argumentative because it's supposed to be.
And also like pushing that further, right? There's this notion that we go to school and we learn certain things to be productive members of society, but what if you don't want to? Like, what if you don't want to get a job? What if you don't care about school and that's not your aim in life?
Also, why does this increment of time exist in the first place? Like, what designates 7:55 in the morning as the time to start school? Like, exactly who oversees this? Who sets this up? What is the point of this? And why is everyone else functioning within this system? And of course, you know, this is a very low stakes argument, but when you start questioning systems of power, this can go very micro to very macro. So when you question all these things, what we're left with is a state of flux in which post-structuralism functions as both disruptor and establisher of power by unwinding power and then disrupting itself. So it's constantly doing and undoing itself. Both of these things need to be in constant play with each other. It all seems quite ambiguous and confusing because it kind of is. Like, there's no other way to say it. The constant questioning and disintegration of binary forms of knowledge leave post-structuralist philosophers at times in opposition of each other's viewpoints without a cohesive connection or even unwinding of their own works. Derrida is notorious for doing this. Within the same text, you would read like an argument being set up as he's unwinding the argument, and then he goes back in the next like sentence and goes, but what if I lied?
So in terms of what this kind of, in Paula's notes, you put hodgepodge praxis, and I really like that word. And this idea of the hodgepodge, right? It's messy, but it has led to actually the establishment of other philosophical practices by questioning things like gender, sexuality, race, colonialism, liberalism, capitalism, other subjects. And we kind of are mentioning these different forms because these are forms of power, right? They're established forms of power that we understand as forms of power now. So subjects like queer theory, as we discussed in our intro to, and in lots and lots of other episodes, both this season and last season, kind of is greatly influenced by post-structuralism. It's actually very interesting. In the poll for the intro to queer theory, we said, what do you want to hear from? Poststructuralism was one of those because we mentioned it in the episode. So poststructuralism also embeds itself not just in linguistics, but also in sociology, history, art, and the sciences to deconstruct the pragmatic approaches of these subjects and transfigure these methodological approaches. And beyond the realms of academia, actually poststructuralism cements itself into politics, arts, and other forms of the everyday. As we continue to describe, poststructuralism is a form of praxis that is implemented into everything from political reform to a canvas. Oh, by the way, can I just say the next part? I love the name. I was laughing about it earlier when I was reading the script.
Because it's true.
Yeah.
So each section I have given a title to sort of divide the school of thought and where we're going. For this one, since we both thought it was kind of funny, we're going to mention it. So this is our section 6, which is opponents of poststructuralism. The poststructuralist? Question mark? So if you've noticed throughout this entire description, we have sort of associated people with poststructuralism, but we actually haven't called them poststructuralists. And that's because they don't want to be poststructuralists. So famously, a friend of the pod, Michel Foucault, denied his associations with poststructuralism despite being seen as one of its greatest contributors. The same can be said with Jacques Derrida, Jacques Deleuze, and Jean Baudrillard, who also all reject the label. It is why describing the movement is so frickin' tricky. They saw value in its label, but really refused to be associated with it. Their contributions and their works within their respective fields of study inherently deconstruct poststructuralism itself. There's no easy and cohesive interpretation between these big names, and they tend to constantly unwind their own work they've already made, so they tend to try and turn their backs onto the label of poststructuralism. Actual opponents of poststructuralism are mostly comprised of political conservative circles, particularly those within the right-wing spaces, who see poststructuralism as the undoing of civilized and contested characteristics of public policy, foreign affairs, and approaches to capitalism. Poststructuralist arguments do not seek to debase or refute the realities of the right, but its incessant inquiring and critiquing destabilizes what is otherwise ought to be naturalized truths. This is not to say that poststructuralism is inherently left-wing. While it tends to be used a lot by the left-leaning groups, it also questions power dynamics within political circles and debates the validity of their own policies. There is a very strong association of Marxist thought and poststructuralism. But that's not to say that poststructuralism is inherently Marxist or inherently communist or inherently socialist. It is because the use of Marx in the Communist Manifesto is the questioning of government structures, is the questioning of power in itself. So it stems from these things as well, but it's not it. So it's very tricky. And Williams in this reading just cements that poststructuralism is political because it is. It's a questioning of power, but it's not political in the way that it is left-wing or right-wing or Green Party or any of these things. So when we talk about disruption and power, we're thinking of the very basic ideas of power, because it also does change by philosophers. There's biopower through Foucault. There's powers of horror, Julia Kristeva.
So I kind of wanted to say that kind of the reason why it might be more left-leaning than right-leaning, because I think that's kind of important to say. So in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's associated with more left-leaning groups, people, all this kind of stuff, and politics in general, because it's questioning and disrupting power, which is what a lot of, not all, a lot of left-leaning politics does. Like you're talking about Marxism, really disrupting and trying to dismantle capitalist understandings or understand capitalism, depending on which Marxist you're
But
looking
inherently, post-structuralism cannot create a system because it's going to be constantly unwinding itself.
Yeah.
So it is used by left-leaning circles, but like, for example, with neoliberalism, you cannot use post-structuralist thought with neoliberalism. It's not going to go well. It's like a toddler consistently going, but why?
But you have, in queer theory now, a real issue with neoliberalism because a lot of queer politics tied itself to neoliberal understandings and tied itself to the politics of the state, you know, the increase of marriage equality and stuff like that. So that's why you might get some queer theorists, etc., questioning these more neoliberal understandings. You have people like Rahul Rao, and you also get people like Jasbir Pawar, who are using queer theory to really question these politics.
Eloquently and beautifully said, because it's true. It's one of those things, like we talk about how it's a praxis, but we don't talk about it as an establishing formation, which is a really good transition also into the last bit of this, which is poststructuralism and the rest of the West. With French founders denying any association, poststructuralism was adopted quite late outside of France through figures like, arguably, we can fight about this in the comments, I guess, Noam Chomsky and definitely Judith Butler. I will argue that History of Sexuality, Volume 1 by Foucault, cemented, at least within the American context, a field of study. I would argue that the cohesion and the labels that came out about solely because it was a necessary descriptor as it introduced these French philosophical thoughts to non-French institutions.
Yeah, basically we like to have words for things so that we can even talk about them. Like I often say to people, you need a language to be able to articulate certain struggles and issues, and poststructuralism was that.
Yeah. But in search of when, where, how, these labels became solidified, I find it once more, it's very slippery. So partially, it is blamed on translation. A lot of these works from French philosophers worked closely within linguistics, making it really difficult to convey the sensation of what is being described or proposed. Even now, many of the words are left in their original French, as it cannot be conveyed in any other way. Secondly, it's the delivery of the works themselves. Foucault and Derrida were known to present the work via public speaking or lecture-style discussions. Sometimes these things were recorded, or there were notes associated with them, or they just went off the cuff. They just started talking. I think in one of the Foucault lectures that we read with James, he completely forgot where he was going. And, you know, it's already a difficult thing to publish all these things in French. Imagine having to translate it into any other language, especially languages that are not Latin-based, like English. Lastly, this is more from my own brain, less established. I think the Western world were just not ready for these conversations. It is telling that the main proponents of poststructuralism are French, a country which is founded upon protest and civil disobedience. Questioning systems of power and the disrupting of the status quo would not start to occur, at least in the US sense, until the Vietnam War. Poststructuralism requires many different factors happening all at once and to be instigated and understood. And this is like going back, going in a full circle, full post-structuralist form. You need to have so many different elements working together in tandem to sort of understand where post-structuralism is going. For us right now, it's so much easier to understand because we're living in a post-Vietnam War world. We're living in a post-Cold War era. We're living in, conflict in the Middle East time. So these things, we're able to see these systems of power a little bit more clearly. Whereas I don't want to say the past was naive, but the past was still establishing these systems of power, especially after the Second World War.
Yeah,
so,
and even more recently, you have top of my brain because I'm writing a chapter on it, but you have things like COVID, which implemented systems of power in ways that people were not aware could happen, which is why you had anti-maskers protesting because they were like, oh my God, you're taking away my civil liberty.
Actually, COVID's a perfect example because I would say a post-structuralist argument would be, why are you infringing upon people's freedom of choice? So I would like to end with, post-structuralism is not a positive. Williams describes it as not a negative. And I think that's the perfect way to say it. Post-structuralism tries to question, tries to do all these things, but it doesn't mean it's positive for you. It's meant to be a disruptor. It's meant to question, and it's meant to debate why we and you as the individual function within these systems of powers, these systems of binaries, these systems of establishment, and why we follow the rules. Why were the rules established? Do these rules make sense? Do we do away with the rules? What happens to those rules afterwards? It doesn't stop. Mm-hmm. So hopefully this kind of made sense.
I think it did. I think it was good. We'll see what people say afterwards. But again, just to reiterate, this is kind of our understanding of post-structuralism. Again, it's one of these things that's highly contested, people arguing left and right.
Left, right, up, down, upside down, turn around.
Literally. And so, if you have thoughts on this, or if there's anybody we have not mentioned that you think would change our ideas on post-structuralism, we'd really love to hear it, because we like learning. That's why we're doing the podcast.
Yeah, and like once more, this is extremely simplified. The larger arguments are made by Williams, and even larger arguments made by the philosophers themselves. Apologies that we stuck to French, mostly male authors, and it's because, unfortunately, that was kind of the scene.
Yeah. So, let us know what you think.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to us in the studio.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information. And please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.